There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone whose patterns confuse you daily. An exhaustion that eventually starts whispering one single tempting word over and over: quit. And for many relationships involving genuine avoidant patterns, that whisper deserves to be honored, deserves to be followed toward genuine release. But not always. Sometimes hidden beneath confusing, painful behavior, there exist genuine signals worth recognizing. Signals that distinguish someone simply incapable of change from someone actively, quietly working through something real. Today, we are going to walk through 5 specific signals worth watching for before you decide this particular chapter has genuinely reached its end. Because giving up prematurely on someone showing real signs of growth costs just as much as staying too long with someone showing none at all. Let's begin with the first signal worth recognizing: a genuine willingness to sit with discomfort rather than immediately fleeing from it. Avoidant patterns typically involve rapid escape from anything resembling emotional intensity: a conversation touching on vulnerability, a request for reassurance, any moment requiring sustained emotional presence. When someone begins demonstrating a different capacity, remaining physically and emotionally present even while visibly uncomfortable, choosing to stay in a difficult conversation rather than retreating into silence or sudden unrelated distraction, this represents genuine, meaningful movement. This does not require perfect composure or complete comfort. It simply requires the presence itself, the choice to remain rather than flee, even while every old instinct clearly still pulls toward escape. Let's talk about why this particular signal matters so significantly, more than words alone ever could. Avoidant defenses are built almost entirely around avoidance, hence the name itself, meaning any demonstrated capacity to resist that avoidance, however imperfectly executed, represents genuine friction against a deeply ingrained pattern. This friction takes real effort that becomes visible through simply staying present during moments that previously would have triggered immediate withdrawal. Watching for this capacity to remain, rather than watching for perfect emotional articulation or flawless vulnerability, provides a more accurate measure of genuine internal work occurring beneath the surface. Let's move to the second signal: genuine curiosity about their own patterns rather than immediate defensiveness when those patterns get gently named. Someone still fully entrenched in avoidant defenses typically responds to any observation about their withdrawal or inconsistency with denial, minimization, or counter-accusation, redirecting attention away from genuine self-examination. Someone beginning genuine growth responds differently, meeting observation with actual curiosity, asking questions about their own behavior rather than immediately deflecting, showing genuine interest in understanding why certain triggers produce certain responses within their own internal experience. Let's talk about what makes this curiosity so significant as a signal worth honoring rather than dismissing. Curiosity requires a kind of internal safety that defensive denial does not. A willingness to examine potentially uncomfortable truths about one's own behavior without immediately collapsing into shame or redirected blame. This safety typically develops gradually, meaning its presence, even in small, inconsistent doses, suggests something genuinely shifting beneath previously rigid defenses. This does not mean every instance of curiosity guarantees complete transformation, but it does represent a meaningfully different internal orientation than the complete defensiveness characteristic of unaddressed avoidant patterns. Let's move to the third signal: initiating repair after conflict, rather than waiting passively for you to manage the aftermath alone. Avoidant patterns typically include a notable absence of repair initiative, leaving reconciliation entirely dependent on the other partner's continued effort and patience. When someone begins reaching out first following disagreement or distance, offering some acknowledgement, even if imperfectly articulated, taking initiative rather than simply waiting for things to naturally smooth over through passive time, this represents significant, meaningful change from previous patterns. Let's talk about why initiative specifically matters so considerably more than simply eventual availability once you have already reached out first. Passive availability, responding warmly once you initiate contact, requires relatively little from someone still operating primarily from avoidant defenses. Active initiative, reaching out first despite the vulnerability this requires, demonstrates genuine investment in repair rather than simply comfortable acceptance of whatever effort you happen to continue providing. This shift from passive to active repair represents one of the more reliable indicators available for distinguishing genuine change from continued reliance on your patient management of the relationship's difficulties. Let's move to the fourth signal: tolerance for your own emotional expression without immediately needing to fix, minimize, or escape from it. Many avoidant individuals struggle considerably with witnessing a partner's genuine emotional expression, experiencing it as overwhelming, as something requiring immediate resolution or immediate distance, rather than simply requiring patient presence. When someone begins developing capacity to simply witness your emotion, offering presence rather than immediate solutions or immediate withdrawal, this represents genuine growth in emotional regulation capacity, both regarding their own emotions and regarding tolerance for someone else's. Let's talk about what distinguishes this genuine tolerance from mere passive silence that might superficially resemble it. Genuine tolerance includes engaged presence, eye contact, verbal acknowledgement, physical closeness that communicates continued connection rather than detached endurance. Passive silence, by contrast, often includes visible discomfort, distraction, or subtle signals of wanting the emotional moment to conclude as quickly as possible. Watching for engaged rather than merely tolerant presence provides a more accurate read on whether genuine capacity has developed, or whether apparent tolerance simply masks continued internal avoidance, waiting for the earliest acceptable moment to escape. Let's move to the fifth and final signal worth examining carefully: consistency that persists even during periods when no immediate crisis or threat to the relationship exists. This particular signal deserves special attention because it addresses one of the most common sources of confusion within avoidant dynamics: effort that appears reliably during moments of crisis or threatened loss, only to recede once security has been sufficiently restored. Genuine consistency looks different, persisting through ordinary, uneventful periods just as reliably as it appears during moments of heightened threat or difficulty. Let's talk about why this final signal often proves the most reliable indicator among all five being discussed throughout this conversation. Crisis motivated effort, however genuine it might feel in the moment it occurs, tends to be driven primarily by fear of loss rather than by sustained internal transformation. Consistency during calm, ordinary periods reveals something considerably more significant: evidence that change has become integrated into daily patterns, rather than remaining reactive, appearing only when triggered by the specific threat of losing access to the relationship entirely. Let's talk about what it means to observe these five signals together, rather than searching for any single one in isolation, because genuine transformation typically involves multiple, mutually reinforcing changes, rather than isolated improvement in only one specific area. Someone demonstrating genuine capacity to remain present, genuine curiosity about their own patterns, genuine initiative toward repair, genuine tolerance for your emotional expression, and genuine consistency independent of crisis together represents considerably more compelling evidence than any single signal appearing in isolation, while the others remain notably absent. Let's talk about the appropriate timeline for observing these signals before drawing meaningful conclusions about what they ultimately indicate. A single instance of any signal, however encouraging it feels in the moment, does not confirm lasting transformation. Genuine confidence in what these signals represent requires sustained observation across weeks and months, watching whether these patterns persist and deepen over time, or whether they represent temporary reactions to a specific moment of heightened relational tension that gradually fade once that tension resolves. Let's return briefly to that first signal: presence during discomfort, because it deserves considerably more texture than a single description can fully capture. This presence often shows up in small, easily overlooked moments, rather than in obvious, dramatic demonstrations. It might look like maintaining eye contact one beat longer than usual during a difficult conversation, resisting the urge to reach for a phone or another distraction the moment tension rises. It might look like a visible pause before responding, evidence of genuine internal processing rather than the immediate reflexive deflection that once characterized their response to any emotional intensity. These small moments, easy to miss if you are not watching closely, accumulate into meaningful evidence when they occur repeatedly rather than as isolated anomalies. Let's talk about what makes this particular signal so difficult for someone with genuine avoidant patterns to fake or perform temporarily, because authenticity here matters considerably for distinguishing real growth from a convincing but ultimately temporary performance. Sustained presence during discomfort requires ongoing physiological regulation, an actual capacity to remain calm enough internally to avoid triggering the fight, flight, or freeze response that typically drives avoidant withdrawal. This physiological capacity cannot be performed indefinitely without genuine underlying development, meaning sustained presence across multiple difficult conversations rather than a single convincing instance offers considerably more reliable evidence of authentic change. Let's return to the second signal, curiosity rather than defensiveness, exploring further what this actually sounds like in practice, rather than remaining purely conceptual. This curiosity might sound like someone asking genuinely, rather than rhetorically, why a particular topic feels so difficult for them to discuss calmly. It might sound like them wondering aloud whether a pattern you have named actually connects to something from their own earlier life, showing genuine interest in understanding, rather than immediately dismissing the observation as unfair or inaccurate. This kind of genuine wondering, however tentative or imperfectly articulated, differs enormously from either complete denial or performed agreement offered simply to end an uncomfortable conversation quickly. Let's talk about a subtle but important distinction worth making here between curiosity that leads toward genuine insight and curiosity that remains purely intellectual, disconnected from any corresponding behavioral change. Genuine curiosity eventually connects back to actual shifts in behavior, insight translating gradually into different choices during similar future situations. Purely intellectual curiosity, by contrast, can persist indefinitely without ever producing corresponding change, becoming almost a sophisticated form of avoidance itself, discussing patterns extensively without ever actually interrupting them. Watching whether curiosity eventually connects to behavioral shift, rather than remaining permanently theoretical, provides an important additional layer of discernment beyond simply noticing curiosity's initial presence. Let's return to the third signal, initiative toward repair, examining more closely what genuine initiative actually looks like compared to gestures that merely resemble it superficially. Genuine initiative often includes specificity, naming what actually happened rather than offering vague, generalized acknowledgement that could apply to almost any disagreement. It includes timing that reflects genuine discomfort with the distance itself, reaching out within a reasonable window rather than allowing days or weeks to pass before any acknowledgement occurs. It includes willingness to have the conversation fully, staying present through your response, rather than delivering a brief apology and then quickly changing the subject to avoid further discomfort. Let's talk about a common pattern worth recognizing directly, initiative that appears consistently after conflict but never proactively, meaning repair only ever gets initiated in response to visible rupture, rather than through ongoing preventive communication about difficulties before they escalate into full conflict. This pattern, while representing genuine improvement over complete absence of repair initiative, still indicates room for further growth, ideally moving toward a capacity for addressing smaller frictions before they require full repair conversations at all. Noticing whether initiative remains purely reactive or gradually becomes more proactive over time offers additional useful information about how deeply this particular growth has actually taken root. Let's return to the fourth signal, tolerance for your emotional expression, adding further nuance to how this specific capacity tends to develop gradually rather than appearing all at once in complete, mature form. Early stages of this developing tolerance might look imperfect, someone remaining present but visibly uncomfortable, perhaps offering slightly clumsy attempts at comfort rather than perfectly attuned emotional support. This imperfection does not indicate failure. Genuine skill development in any domain typically moves through visibly imperfect stages before reaching greater fluency, and emotional tolerance represents no exception to this general pattern of gradual, imperfect improvement over time. Let's talk about what specifically to watch for that would indicate this tolerance is genuinely developing, rather than remaining permanently stuck at an early, uncomfortable stage. Look for whether their capacity to remain present during your emotional expression gradually extends in duration, tolerating longer, more sustained emotional conversations than they could previously manage. Look for whether their attempts at comfort or support, even if imperfect, become gradually more attuned to what you actually need in those moments, rather than remaining generic or somewhat disconnected from your specific expressed feelings. This gradual refinement over time offers more reliable evidence than expecting immediate, complete mastery of a skill that reasonably takes considerable practice to develop. Let's return to the fifth signal: consistency independent of crisis, exploring further what this looks like specifically within the texture of ordinary, everyday interaction, rather than only during moments of heightened relational significance. This might look like continued, reliable communication during entirely mundane periods, checking in simply because they genuinely want to connect, rather than only reaching out when something specific requires addressing. It might look like maintained warmth during stretches of time when nothing particularly eventful is occurring within the relationship. Warmth that does not require active maintenance through your continued effort in order to remain present and available. Let's talk about why this particular pattern of ordinary consistency often takes the longest among all five signals to become genuinely reliable, deserving, therefore, the most patient, extended observation before drawing firm conclusions about its authenticity. Crisis motivated effort activates relatively quickly, triggered directly by threat and fear of loss. Consistency during ordinary periods requires something considerably more difficult to develop: a genuinely internalized value around maintaining connection that does not depend on external threat for its activation. This deeper, more integrated form of consistency typically develops last among the changes being discussed throughout this entire framework, meaning its genuine presence, once established, often represents the most reliable overall indicator of lasting, complete transformation. Let's talk about what happens when you observe some of these five signals clearly, while others remain notably absent or inconsistent. A common and confusing situation deserving direct acknowledgement rather than false clarity about what a mixed picture ultimately indicates. Partial presence of these signals does not necessarily mean the entire framework should be dismissed, but it does suggest that transformation remains genuinely in progress rather than fully complete, deserving continued patient observation, focused specifically on whether the currently absent signals gradually begin appearing over subsequent months, or whether they remain permanently and consistently missing despite considerable additional time passing. Let's talk about the specific danger of becoming so focused on searching for these five signals that you inadvertently overlook your own genuine intuition and lived experience within the relationship, treating this framework as a rigid checklist, rather than as one useful tool among several available for informing your overall assessment. Your own accumulated sense of the relationship, developed through direct daily experience, remains equally valuable alongside this more structured framework, and any tension between what this framework suggests and what your own intuition tells you deserves careful, honest examination rather than automatic deference to either source alone. Let's talk about what your own well-being requires while you continue observing for these signals over the extended timeline genuine assessment actually requires, because continued observation should not come at the cost of your own ongoing depletion or suspended well-being. Watching for growth over time does not mean placing your entire life on hold, anxiously monitoring every interaction for confirmation or disconfirmation of hope. It means continuing to invest in your own life, your own interests, your own separate sources of meaning and support, while remaining reasonably attentive to these signals as they naturally arise within the ordinary course of the relationship, rather than constructing an exhausting, hyper-vigilant surveillance system focused entirely on detecting every possible indicator. Let's talk about the specific value of communicating some of what you are observing directly, rather than silently tracking these signals without ever naming what you have noticed. Sharing genuine appreciation when you notice one of these signals occurring, acknowledging specifically what you observed and why it mattered to you, reinforces the behavior in a way that silent observation alone cannot accomplish. This does not mean offering constant, performative praise for every small gesture, but it does mean occasionally, genuinely, letting them know that their effort toward presence, curiosity, initiative, tolerance, or consistency has been noticed and valued, providing meaningful positive reinforcement for behavior that likely still requires considerable ongoing effort to sustain. Let's talk about what happens specifically when you point out the absence of one of these signals, rather than only reinforcing their presence, because honest communication requires addressing both what is working and what continues to be missing. This might involve gently naming a pattern you have not yet observed, wondering aloud whether they have noticed the same absence themselves, creating space for honest conversation about what continued growth might specifically require going forward. This kind of direct, honest naming, offered without excessive harshness, but also without excessive softening, supports continued growth considerably more effectively than either silent disappointment or explosive criticism ever could. Let's talk about the specific role patience plays throughout this entire observation process. Patience that differs meaningfully from the kind of unlimited, boundaryless patience discussed in other conversations about avoidant dynamics. This patience involves genuine openness to growth unfolding at its own natural pace, without demanding immediate, complete transformation, while simultaneously maintaining clear internal limits around how long you remain willing to wait for consistent, genuine evidence before requiring some kind of decision about the relationship's overall direction. This balance, patient but not infinite, represents considerably healthier ground than either premature abandonment of genuine progress or indefinite tolerance of insufficient change. Let's talk about what it means to trust your own capacity to eventually recognize when enough time has genuinely passed without sufficient evidence, transitioning from patient observation toward acceptance that this particular relationship may not be capable of providing what you genuinely need, regardless of how much additional patience you might continue extending. This transition point differs for every relationship and every person, but trusting your own accumulated wisdom, built through direct observation over meaningful time, to eventually recognize this threshold represents an important capacity worth developing, alongside the more specific framework of 5 signals discussed throughout this conversation. Let's talk about what happens to your own sense of hope throughout this extended observation period, because hope here deserves careful calibration, neither entirely suppressed nor allowed to operate without any grounding in actual observed evidence. Healthy hope during this process remains connected to what you are genuinely witnessing, growing stronger when signals appear consistently and reliably, tempering appropriately when signals remain absent or inconsistent, despite considerable time having passed. This grounded hope, responsive to actual evidence rather than operating independently of it, protects you from both premature pessimism that dismisses genuine progress too quickly and premature optimism that ignores genuine absence of change for far too long. Let's talk about what genuine self-respect looks like throughout this entire process of patient, informed observation. Self-respect that does not require immediate resolution or immediate certainty about the relationship's ultimate outcome. Self-respect here means continuing to honor your own needs and boundaries throughout the observation period itself, not waiting until some future point of final decision to begin treating yourself with the consideration and care you genuinely deserve. This ongoing self-respect, maintained consistently throughout the entire process rather than reserved only for after a final decision gets made, protects your own well-being regardless of how long genuine assessment ultimately requires or how the relationship eventually resolves. Let's talk about a specific complication worth naming directly. What happens when someone demonstrates genuine, consistent growth in some of these 5 areas, while remaining notably stuck in others? An outcome considerably more common than either complete transformation or complete absence of change across the board. This mixed pattern deserves honest, nuanced evaluation, rather than being forced artificially into either a fully positive or fully negative overall assessment. Consider which specific signals matter most given the particular history and needs of your own relationship, recognizing that the relative importance of each signal may differ depending on what specific patterns previously caused the most significant harm or difficulty within your particular dynamic. Let's talk about what it means when growth appears genuine, but painfully slow, testing your patience even while technically meeting the criteria of gradual, authentic transformation described throughout this discussion. Slow growth deserves distinction from absent growth, but it also deserves honest acknowledgement that your own patience, however extensive, still carries genuine limits worth respecting. There is no contradiction in recognizing genuine, authentic effort, while simultaneously acknowledging that the pace of that effort may not align with what your own timeline and needs genuinely require, particularly if considerable time has already been invested waiting for this growth to develop more fully. Let's talk about the specific role external support plays throughout this extended period of patient observation, because navigating this kind of nuanced, uncertain evaluation alone often proves considerably more difficult than navigating it with genuine outside perspective available. Trusted friends, family members, or professional support can offer valuable outside observation, sometimes noticing patterns or shifts that prove difficult to see clearly from directly inside the relationship itself. This outside perspective does not need to make final decisions on your behalf, but it can provide valuable additional data points worth considering alongside your own direct observation and the framework of 5 signals discussed throughout this entire conversation. Let's talk about what it means to communicate clearly with your partner about this entire framework itself, rather than silently evaluating them against criteria they may not even be aware exist. Sharing directly what specifically would help you feel more confident about the relationship's genuine direction, describing these signals not as a secret test, but as honest information about what genuine repair and growth would actually look like from your perspective, often proves considerably more productive than silent observation alone. This transparency allows your partner genuine opportunity to understand what specific behaviors would actually address your concerns, rather than guessing indefinitely at what might eventually satisfy an unstated internal standard. Let's talk, finally, about what remains true throughout this entire process of patient, informed observation, regardless of how the relationship ultimately resolves. Your capacity to hold both genuine hope and genuine discernment simultaneously, neither abandoning hope prematurely nor extending it indefinitely without corresponding evidence, represents genuine emotional maturity worth recognizing in yourself throughout this difficult process. Whatever you ultimately decide, having engaged this process thoughtfully, watching for genuine evidence, rather than either premature pessimism or ungrounded optimism, ensures that whatever conclusion you eventually reach will be one built on genuine understanding, rather than reactive emotion alone. A foundation that serves you well, regardless of which direction this particular relationship ultimately takes. Let's talk about the specific way these 5 signals tend to interact with each other over time, because growth in one area often gradually supports growth in the others, rather than each developing entirely in isolation. Someone developing genuine capacity for presence during discomfort often finds this capacity naturally supporting increased curiosity about their own patterns, since remaining present allows the kind of internal reflection that immediate escape would otherwise prevent entirely. Similarly, genuine curiosity often naturally feeds into increased initiative toward repair, since understanding one's own patterns more clearly tends to produce increased motivation to address the impact of those patterns proactively, rather than waiting passively for the other person to manage difficulty alone. Watching for this kind of natural, interconnected development, rather than expecting each signal to appear as a completely separate, isolated achievement, provides a more accurate and hopeful picture of how genuine transformation actually tends to unfold in practice. Let's talk about what it means to remain genuinely encouraged by early, imperfect versions of these signals, without requiring them to appear in fully mature, polished form before counting as meaningful evidence. Growth rarely arrives complete and fully formed. It typically begins in small, halting, imperfect attempts, gradually strengthening through repeated practice over considerable time. Recognizing and genuinely honoring these early, imperfect attempts, rather than dismissing them as insufficient simply because they fall short of complete mastery, supports continued growth considerably more effectively than requiring perfection before offering any acknowledgement or encouragement at all. Let's talk one final time about what this entire framework ultimately offers you, beyond simply a checklist for evaluating someone else's behavior. It offers you a way of remaining hopeful without becoming naive, a way of remaining discerning without becoming cynical, a way of honoring both your own genuine care for this person and your own genuine need for evidence before extending continued trust and continued investment. This balance, difficult as it is to maintain consistently, represents exactly the kind of wisdom that protects you from the two most common pitfalls within relationships involving avoidant patterns: giving up too soon on someone genuinely capable of meaningful change, or holding on far too long to someone who, despite your most patient hope, has simply not yet demonstrated the genuine evidence that continued investment actually requires. And so, if you have been watching someone you love and wondering whether continued patience represents wisdom or simply prolonged, unnecessary suffering, I want you to hold these 5 signals as a genuine, useful framework rather than as false hope offered without foundation. If you are witnessing genuine presence during discomfort, genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness, genuine initiative toward repair, genuine tolerance for your emotional expression, and genuine consistency, independent of crisis, sustained not just once, but repeatedly over meaningful time, this represents real evidence worth taking seriously. But if these signals remain absent, if the same old patterns continue regardless of how clearly you have communicated their impact, trust that absence just as fully as you would trust their genuine presence, because both, equally, deserve to guide whatever decision ultimately serves your own well-being moving forward.